Hi everyone, this video is looking at paper 2 of the EDUQAS GCSE English language. This is looking at question 6, which is the second compare question. So like I said, it will be the final question in the exam. So right at the bottom of your screen there. So for this question, it's question 6, like I said. How many marks? It's worth 10 marks. How many points or quotes should you make? You're looking to make 5 comparisons between the two texts with quotes. How are you going to get your marks? Quotes from each extract to support points of comparison. Analysis of the effect on the reader. So that's basically 2 of your bullet points. And what do you need to avoid? So we don't need a lot of terminology. You can use some terminology, but you're not going to be waffling. So we don't need 7-line point evidence explains. You just need to find the information and say why it's been used. So if we look at the question then, it's question 6. Both of these texts are about expeditions to the South Pole. Compare the hardships Scott and Fogle endured on their expeditions, how Scott and Fogle got their feelings about the hardships across to the reader. So basically, first bullet point is what are the bad things and negative things they had to go through, but then also how did the writer get this across. So like I said, it's 10 marks, so that means you should be spending about 13 to 15 minutes. How many points and quotes? So we said where you make 5 points with a quote from both extracts on each of the points. I would say this is the most complex question in the exam because it's a bit of it's a mixture there. We've got the how question, but we've also got to get a bit of information retrieval in there. So I'd say it's the toughest one. So it's the last question in the exam, which on average students do the worst on, but it's through time management. So you've got to make sure you give yourself 15 or 16 minutes to answer this question. So you would already read both texts in the exam. So on questions 1, 2, 3 and 4, you've already read these texts. So you're going to be familiar with them. So it probably means you're going to be skimming on this question rather than reading the whole thing and taking 10 minutes or so to do so. You can say both texts are the same or different. In fact, you probably will be saying that. But be clear which one you're talking about. So a really easy way of doing this is just use their names. So Fogle and Scott. If the examiner doesn't know which one you're talking about, you're not going to get a mark. So don't fail this question just by doing something silly like that. And don't worry if you feel like you might be repeating points you've already written in past questions. So it is question 6. So you might be feeling like you're repeating part of the how question from question 2. Don't worry about that. Just answer the question. If the quote is needed, use that quote. Don't worry about repeating yourself. You're going to be asked to compare the things the two writers said on a topic. This means picking out the similarities and differences in what they say, and also importantly how they say it. So you want to get high marks in these questions? Well, let's use these kind of words. So simile, on the other hand, likewise, in contrast, whereas, in comparison. So using these words, these are showing to the examiner that you're comparing and contrasting. So it's really important if you use these kind of words. So basically you need to try and find something that links and connects the extracts in some way. These extracts haven't been picked by random, they've been picked. So there are things that are going to be linking, so try and find what these are. Obviously you're hopefully going to get the obvious ones, but where you're going to get higher marks is maybe reading between the lines and more subtle things that you've read into. So you can look at the two extracts, and if you want this extract, it's the Ben Fogle Captain Scott. There is a link to the exam paper in the YouTube video. So you need to look for something that is similar, but maybe the writer has communicated it in a different way. So for example, in these texts you're going to say that they both suffered with the weather, but you're going to say maybe they talk about it in a different way. Terminology is not needed, so you can use a little bit. If it comes easy to you, say it's an adjective, say it's a verb, but we don't really need it a lot in this question. So there's the question again then. It's about the South Pole. You need to compare the things they've went through and then also how Scott and Fogle, who are the writers of the extract, get their feelings across the hardships. So remember, it is about the hardships, so you don't need to talk about other stuff. So be specific to the question. So we don't need to say that Ben Fogle had a really nice time on the trip, because that's not what the question's about. It's things that they suffered. So I want you to do now, do it together or pause the video, track through both texts, so go from start to bottom of the highlighter and look for key parts about the question. So just about the things they've suffered, and then highlight the key points. So here's my highlight, what I've highlighted. So I've highlighted thought he was going to die. So it's important to talk about structure. So it literally starts with that he thinks he was going to die. Then another hardship they had to go through was the physical side of it. So they had to walk 480 miles of snow in 18 days. Okay. The weather, so it was minus 50 degrees at times. It's called hostile, it's called advanced. Medical problems, so they had hypothermia, frostbite, lips, blisters, pneumonia, so all of these chest infections. They had loads of stuff to do with medical problems, so that's something they had to suffer. Even the tent, so in this extract, they had a small 3-man tent, but it was lightweight and it was able to handle the Atlantic storms. And also this extract, if you talk about we comment on the structure of it, it starts off with a dramatic moment and it ends on a high. So it actually starts off as its most dramatic moment and then sort of goes down throughout the article and it ends on a high note where he's laughing on the he's laughing about what the trip was like. Other things we could have talked about were that he finished the race. Yeah, maybe that's not to do with hardships too much. But then it says they had a vast hostile landscape. So what does hostile have connotations with? Aggression, hostility. Yeah. They didn't eat enough, so you could talk about the food. Mensa, they burnt 9,000 calories a day, but they were only getting 3,500. They thought the food was disgusting at some point. So there's the first one. Then we look at the second extract. Let's have a look. So it starts badly, a bit like the other one. So they both start really badly. Ben Fogle starts thinking he's going to die. This one starts, they've woken up to a really aggressive storm. They had little food, a thin breakfast, and the food they did have had to be rationed. The weather, it was really awful weather, howling blizzard, raging violently. The tent, so as in comparison to Ben Fogle, who had a good tent, this one's got a 19th century tent where the tent is absolutely wet through, it's very, very wet, very, very uncomfortable. And this one ends badly. So the Ben Fogle one started on a high. This one ends really badly wet. It's almost at their state where they think they're going to die. It's an absolute hopeless situation. Other things we could have talked about were, again, the weather is awful. It's utterly miserable. His mood is really bad and he feels like the situation is hopeless. So what I would do now for this question, you could do this on your exam, is draw a really simple table out like I've got. I put Fogle on one side, Scott on the other side, and then all I'm going to do is list as I go through the extract, list the hardships, and list the things they've had to suffer. So I've just started with Fogle thought he was going to die, and then physical exhaustion, 481 miles. So those are the first two things I've found. And then Scott, raging howling blizzard, thin breakfast. So just go down it on each extract and see if you can find 4 or 5 hardships that you can talk about in your exam. Okay, after you've done that, I want you to number the bullet points on both extracts to see where linked. So on my Fogle one, I've got thought he was going to die, physical exhaustion, finished the race, medical problems, cold, hostile environment, not eating enough, dinner disgusting, good tent, starts on a low, ends on a high, and it's past tense. So what I mean by past tense is that Fogle was looking back on the whole thing. We know he survived, we know he's been okay. For Scott, I've got raging howling blizzard, thin breakfast, awful weather, tents were wet through, spirits were down, he was miserable, not a lot of food left. It starts on a low point and ends on a low point. He cannot move, it's impossible to move. Present tense. Okay, so what I mean by that is Scott is going through this as we're hearing how he's going as he's doing it. So we don't know if Scott's going to be okay. So the reader would be worried about Scott. So how am I going to link these things? So number one, thought he was going to die. That's Fogle. I'm going to link that to that he can't move in an impossible situation with Scott. Number two, past tense. Okay, so what I'm going to compare it, I'm going to say Fogle is looking back on it, while Scott, number two, is present tense, so he's going through it at the moment. Number three, we're going to talk about enjoying the trip. Well, I don't like that one, so I'm going to forget that one. It's not a great point. But number four, we can talk about the food. So number four for Fogle, I've got not eating enough, and then for Scott, I've got thin breakfast, and they're rationing their food. So I'm going to talk about those two together. Number five, Fogle, I've got cold, minus 50 degrees, minus 50 centigrade. And Scott, I've got awful weather. So I've got to go linking those ones. So you'll see what I've done is I've linked them all up in the table, left to right. So then I'm going to compare. It doesn't always have to be the same, or it doesn't have to be different. There's probably going to be a mixture of the two. But this is a really simple way of seeing on a page. You can do it on an exam page. Really seeing, really simply, really easily where they match up, what compares, what doesn't compare. So how are we going to structure our answer then, now that we've got our things that we're going to compare and not compare? So, structure. Use the sentence starter, both writers. So it shows straight away to the examiner I'm going to be comparing. I'm talking about two extracts. Then you are going to give an overview of the main question. So I'm going to say both writers suggest, so not really an overview, I'm just going to go into my first point. Both writers suggest the weather was a massive hardship on the trip. Okay, remember, I'm linking back to the question. The question said hardship, I'm putting hardship in my little intro. So both writers suggest the weather was a massive hardship. Now all I'm going to say now is what tells me that from extract 1 and what tells me that from extract 2. Okay, Fogle says the temperature was sometimes -50 and were bitterly cold, which suggests the weather is extremely harsh. So it isn't an easy search and find question, so I've not just put bitterly cold, I'm putting what that quote suggests. So bitterly suggests the weather was extremely harsh. It's not just cold, it's bitterly cold. Okay, if I wanted to, I could add it's an adverb there that's been used. Then also I've put similarly, Scott says the storm moved on violently. Both writers use adverb to show the pain and punishment they receive from the weather. So, in the first paragraph and the first line of the second bit, I've said what hardships, and then the second part I've answered the second bullet point. I've said what effect does it have? Well, I've said that the fact they've used bitterly and violently, they're both adverbs, but they're both adverbs to show the pain and punishment they receive from the weather. They're both adverbs that show the reader how awful the conditions were. And then also I've got my little adverbial there, my simile, so I'm saying that at this point they actually talk about the same things about the weather. They're both saying how awful the weather is. Okay, again, these are the words I'm using. Similarly, on the other hand, likewise, in comparison, in contrast. Okay, so there are loads of points I've got. So it looks like I've got 6 points there, which is really, really good. I've done really well. But remember, and there's all the adverbials there in comparison, whereas, simile, in contrast, yeah, on the other hand, things like that. So there I've shown I'm using them, shown the example I'm comparing. But I've only done 6 points, which is really good. If I'm doing that, I'm doing really well. I've also put in loads of quotes. So even though there's 6 points, how many quotes have I got here? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've probably got 15 quotes in my 6 points. The examiners love you using quotes. As many quotes as you can use. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, they call it tracking through the text. So if you show that you've got quotes from the start, middle and end, they will absolutely love you for it. Okay. Okay, and also, yeah, so my yellow there are my quotes if you didn't work that out. So let's go through a few points we're going to make. So each time what I'm going to do is I'm going to say both writers say something, then I'm going to give a quote from each one, and I might say that both writers say something, however they do it in different ways or they do it in the same way. So both writers use punishing vocab to describe the hardships they suffered. That's the point I'm making. Fogle says the landscape is hostile, suggesting it's aggressive and something they're fighting against. Similarly, the motif of aggression is present with Scott when he uses the adjective raging to describe the environment. So each one I've said hostile has been used because it shows how awful it is. Raging has been used to show how awful it is. But I've also explained why they've used those words. They could have just said it was really miserable, but they've used hostile and they've used raging for a reason. The writer wants to get something across. So hostile, if someone, it's almost like someone who wants to fight you or something, isn't it? So I've said it's aggressive. Well, I've said raging again. If someone is in a rage with you, they're violent, they're temperamental. Yeah. So that is what they're suggesting about the weather. Also, I've got my adverbial in there with simile. Okay, both expeditions to the South Pole suffered major problems. Okay, so that's my point. The main hardship for Fogle was that he thought he was going to die, which tells the reader the expedition was nearly fatal. So again, using a quote, I've explained the quote. In comparison, so now I'm saying they've done a different thing. So in comparison, Scott's trip seems to be just as dangerous as all of us are certain it's impossible to move. Okay, then I've zoomed in on the quote. Why had they just said, he could have just said, I think it's impossible, but he said all of us. Why have they done that? Well, all suggests that Scott is not just being paranoid, but it's the whole group. And the reader, importantly, because they're talking to us, know they're in a bleak situation. So if I just said, I think it's impossible, people would probably believe me. But if we had a group of us and we all said it, a collective, then people are really going to take that seriously. Okay, another difference, my point. One difference in how the hardships are put across to the reader is the timing of the writing. So now I'm going to talk about something that they contrast. In the article, Fogle was looking back on what has happened to him, whereas Scott is writing things as they happen. Then the effect on the reader. The reader knows that Fogle is safe, but is still afraid for Scott after the extract, which makes it more dramatic. Fogle is being interviewed, whereas Scott is writing a diary. So Scott being a first-hand account makes it more personal and direct, whereas Fogle is a bit more removed. It's a bit more removed because there's a middleman, isn't it? It's not just Fogle talking to us, it's Fogle talking to the interviewer, who's then giving it to us. So it makes it a bit more personal for Scott, who's literally writing the diaries that he thought were just for him. Use of whereas shows me the comparison and contrast. Point. Both writers show that food was a hardship for Fogle. Fogle says people back home would think it was disgusting and they weren't eating enough calories. However, they did have lots of food, salami, chocolate, cheese, blah, blah, blah. In contrast, I'm saying this is a different thing. In contrast, Scott had rationed meat, biscuits and a thin breakfast, suggesting we're starving. Okay, I've zoomed in on the word thin. Why have they said thin? To suggest they're really hungry. And also the word ration suggests they will become hungrier as their portion size diminishes. So if you ration your food, it means you're getting less. Both writers suggest the weather was a massive hardship on the trip. Okay, we've talked about this one, so we'll say it anyway. Fogle says the temperature was sometimes -50 and was bitterly cold, which suggests the weather was extremely harsh. Scott says the storm moved violently. Both writers, blah, blah, blah. We talked about that one. And then Scott also had to suffer the hardship of the 19th century tech, which is very, very wet, whereas Fogle's modern version was lightweight and triumphed over the bitter storm. So, really simple point. I've just compared. One of the temps was brilliant, one of them was rubbish. So, talked about that. Another point, both writers use structure differently to describe the hardships. Fogle starts with the most dramatic moment, I thought I was going to die, but then gets more positive, whereas Scott's diary becomes more and more dramatic as time goes on. So, I've said that they've got in common that they use structure to describe how bad it is, but then I've said, well, but actually they differ in terms of what they do. So Fogle, we start with a dramatic moment to get the reader's attention and go down, where all the way through with Scott, the tension builds and gets the reader more and more into it as we get on. So they almost do it in an opposite way. Okay, so there you are, they're all together. And also, there probably could have been 10 or 11 things that I could have written about, but I've just picked my 6 that I like. Okay, and here's another example. This is a grade, so that one I showed you was sort of like a higher version. This is a grade 4 or 5 version, so read it through. Basically, the person makes quite a lot of good points, but they don't do the second bullet point. So the first bullet point is saying all the hardships they do. Brilliant, they've done really well there, but they've done nothing about the second bullet point. So they've said nothing about how it affects the reader. So you say all the hardships. So for example, you say they compare how they talk about the weather, but then they've not gone into the details. So they've not said raging weather. So what does raging suggest? Well, raging suggests it's aggressive, it's almost punishing the men. So they've done one bullet point, but they need to do the second bullet point, and so do you if you want to get good grades. Okay, to sum up then this question, it's the second compare question, number 6. It's worth 10 marks. You should be looking for 5 comparisons with quotes for each one, and an analysis on the effect in reader. So you're going to get marks for picking out the quotes, picking out and saying why it's hard, but then you're going to say, well, why has the writer done what they've done? What do you need to do? We don't need loads of terminology, and do not waffle. So hopefully this has been a good insight into this question for you. Hopefully you'll be a bit more confident in this question. It's the last question in the exam, so hopefully you can fly out the exam knowing how confident you are, and hopefully you'll get great marks.